Iconic, The Economy of Certainty, An Introduction to the Typology of Islamic Legal Theory by Aron Zysow, Harvard University, 1984, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Chapter 1. This steadfastness of the Hanafis in upholding the Daruri doctrine calls for some explanation. A number of considerations suggest themselves. In the first place, we may be dealing here with a theological conservatism which appears to be characteristic of the Hanafis. Furthermore, the Hanafis may have been inclined to retain a doctrine which they felt divided them from the Shafi'is, who were, as we have seen, identified by some with iktisab, acquisition, the iktisab position. In the case of some Hanafis, however, the explanation is closer to hand. They could not classify tawatur knowledge as muqtasab, because that category already had an occupant, the mashhur tradition. Title: The Mashhur Tradition. The Mashhur or Mustafid tradition is defined by Samarkandi as one which was in the Ahad category in the beginning, but which in the second generation became widespread, ishtahara, among the scholars to the point that it was transmitted by a number whose conspiracy to lie is inconceivable. We are obviously dealing here with an innovated category, one which depends on the traditional division into mutawatir and non-mutawatir. It is therefore not surprising that Samarkandi continues, "Our masters have differed as to its epistemological status, for there is no transmitted teaching from our founders." The history of the Mashhur tradition within the Hanafi school takes us back to Isa bin Aban, dies 221, commensurate with 836, and Jassas, in his refutation of Bishr al-Marisi. Ibn Aban had accepted the common classification of traditions into mutawatir and non-mutawatir, but within the second category he had made a distinction between various classes of traditions. The denial of the validity of a tradition from a given class entailed a corresponding degree of condemnation. He recognized 3 degrees of condemnation aside from unbelief, which of course followed upon rejection of mutawatir tradition. The most severe was to be found erring, tadlil. Such was the status of one who rejected the stoning of those who engaged in illicit sexual intercourse and met the appropriate legal conditions. Following this was the condition of the sinner who rejected, for example, the wiping of the foot covering in place of the washing of feet in minor ablution. Finally, error would characterize someone who rejected the tradition fixing the minimum period of menstruation. Thus, within the Ahad tradition, Ibn Aban recognized various degrees of validity based on the reception that had been accorded these traditions by the early Muslim community. He does not seem, however, to have employed an epistemological terminology to correspond to these categories. The terms of condemnation apparently served this purpose. Jassas, on the other hand, claimed that along with the Daruri mutawatir, there existed another grade of mutawatir tradition which is known to be authentic by inference. This is the Mashhur tradition. Its acceptance in the second generation can only be due to the fact that the followers were certain of its authenticity. But since we gather this by inference, the knowledge produced by such a tradition is distinct from that produced by a tradition which is mutawatir at every stage in its transmission. The widespread acceptance that these traditions found is likened to consensus. The Mashhur tradition is that which the scholars of age have favourably received, so that there exists a consensus of the people of the age to accept it. Its status is thus that of consensus, and since the latter imposes certain knowledge, so does the former. Jassas claimed to find support for his view in the teaching of Abu Yusuf that the tradition of wiping the footgear abrogated the Quran. Since the Quran can be abrogated only by a mutawatir tradition, this, quote, indicates that he held among the mutawatir traditions that there are those whose authenticity is known by inference, this being the case with the rubbing of the footgear. No one can claim to know its authenticity and soundness without inference. The tradition in question, it should be noted, is one which Isa bin Aban has associated with the second level of condemnation. Jassas considers the rejection of this tradition as equivalent to the rejection of mutawatir tradition, and presumably this would entail unbelief. This, in any case, came to be seen as Jassas's position. In opposition to this, these other Hanafis upheld and elaborated upon the position of Isa bin Aban. A tradition of this sort did not, in their opinion, yield certain knowledge. It was in this case non-mutawatir, that it did stand apart from the ordinary unit tradition and called for a category of its own. But whereas Ibn Aban had spoken of several degrees of validity within the category of non-mutawatir, the latter scholars recognized a separate category, the mashhur tradition, which inspired confidence but not certainty. One advantage of this new position was apparent in theology. Nadam had been able to attack the mutawatir category by pointing out to traditions of Jews and Christians, Jews and Zoroastrians, which were mutawatir but false. These traditions, it was now argued, were not really mutawatir but only mashhur. The reports of Zoroaster's miracles had originated in the narrow circles of the king and had been spread abroad to enhance royal power. There was in fact a conspiracy at root of these traditions, as mashhur traditions could inspire no more than confidence, and they were to be rejected in the face of the Quran, whose authenticity was absolutely certain because its transmission was mutawatir. Thus there emerged two views on the mashhur tradition. One associated with Isa bin Aban, refused to brand an unbeliever one who rejected the mashhur tradition. The other view regarded the mashhur tradition as a subcategory of the mutawatir. To reject it was to become an unbeliever. For the first view, the mashhur was a category in its own right, parallel to the mutawatir and the ahad. The disagreement was evidently regarded as a significant one. For Article 16 of the Wasiyah of Abu Hanifa reads as follows: We confess that the moistening of shoes is obligatory for those who are at home during day and night, for travellers during 3 days and nights. This is founded in our tradition in this sense. However, whosoever should reject it would be in danger of unbelief, this tradition being nearly equivalent to an absolutely reliable report. Stay tuned for many more parts.